Hello everybody, we are in Los Angeles today. I'm at the home of my old friend Jonathan Taplin, longtime Hollywood producer, entrepreneur, writer on technology. And I began my conversation with Taplin today by asking him if he remembers where he was on June the 6th, 1968, when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel.
So on June 6, 1968, I was living in a little house outside of Princeton, New Jersey. My roommates and I had rented it for our junior year in Princeton, and they had all gone home, and I was left there because I was working for Judy Collins for the summer, and so I had to stay on the East Coast. And I was watching the California primary results on TV, and midnight, 1 o'clock East Coast time, it was announced that Kennedy had won, and he gave a victory speech, which was really amazing speech, full of hope. And you know, for those of us who had been working on his campaign and fighting for him, he represented, I think, the last real hope of liberal democracy at the time, in the sense that I thought he could end the war, he could heal the racial divisions, and he could deal with economic inequality, which was one of his big themes. And the speech was finished, and then literally within minutes, we heard that he'd been shot. And I had put so much hope into the notion of the democratic process, that somehow these issues that we've been battling for 2 years about the war could be resolved. And then it was just all shot to hell. And I walked outside the house, and they hadn't announced that he was dead, but I knew he was dead. I mean, we had lost Martin Luther King 2 months before, and we had lost Bobby's brother John 5 years before, and it just felt like he didn't have a chance. And so I just felt bereft. And I think a lot of people in my generation kind of let go of organized politics that night. And for me, I just made a transition to, you know, I was already working in the music business, and I had already spent a lot of time with the band and Bob Dylan, and you know, that was where I was going to go. I was going to put my energy into art, and the hell with politics. And of course, that's a sad thing, because, you know, the result of that ultimately is Richard Nixon becomes president. But on the other hand, sometimes the culture rises up when the politics goes really right-wing. And that was an example. If you think about the music business and the movie business from 1968 to 1978, it was probably the greatest time of American creativity ever. I mean, you look at the statistics, the music business went from about 11 billion a year to 20 billion a year in revenue in 10 years. So it essentially doubled. The movie business everything from The Godfather to the movie I made, Mean Streets, to, so many great movies.
I mean, astonishing, John. Apocalypse Now, The Conversation.
Culturally, it was one of the greatest vital
Chinatown, made here in Los Angeles, perhaps the greatest of all Los Angeles-based films.
So, that's why sometimes when people feel deeply depressed about the political situation, my hope is that once again the culture will kind of rise up and take its responsibility and make some art that moves people instead of art that just is cartoons.
John, I want to come back to that more positive, but let's go back to '68, to June '68. You talked about knowing that Kennedy was dead even before he died. David Leonhardt, the New York Times economics writer, wrote a book recently about the death of the American dream, and he dates it, not necessarily formally with the death of Kennedy, but with the failure of the politics, if you like, of Bobby Kennedy and his exit from the political scene. You seem to be suggesting the same thing. What was it about Bobby Kennedy that was so vital, that attracted so many different types of people?
Well, look, the Democratic Party was very different in '68 in the sense that it still was the party of the working man. And it also happened to be, with Bobby, the party of the college elite, if whatever word you want to do, of the intellectuals, of the thinking people. And so that merger of those two groups made something possible, which is obviously, in the wake of the election of 2024, is obviously not happening right now. But that was a very unique situation, and Bobby also obviously carried with him the great love that the people had for his older brother that had gotten terminated. And so the Latino population, if you think about Cesar Chavez campaigning with him, the black population, Rosie Greer was his bodyguard. I mean, it was a great deal of love for him in many, many ways. Plus, he was an extraordinary communicator. There's a famous speech that he gave totally spontaneously the night that he was giving a speech, and someone came up and whispered in his ear that Martin Luther King had just been killed. And he just announced to the audience, which was at least half of them were black, and there was just all the air went out of the room, and just grasping, and people were crying, and everything else. And he began to talk, and he somehow went to some Aeschylus quote and Greek mythology, and somehow got people to think that despite this incredible tragedy, we still had to keep fighting, which was true. But he was a unique, amazing politician, and in that way, I think he reached us in a way that I haven't seen anybody do it since.
Yeah, the irony is, of course, he was the closest thing to an American aristocrat, and yet the working class, and particularly the white working class, was enormously loyal to him. He wasn't a new left candidate. He wasn't really the college candidate. He became an intellectual in a sense, but he was never defined, perhaps unlike his brother, by his intellect.
Right. No, that's totally true. I mean, was not on the left side only insofar as he was against the war. And quite honestly, with the exception of Eugene McCarthy, there weren't a whole lot of other important Democratic politicians who would stand up to Johnson and say the war has to end. So that in itself was pretty important. And so that gave him the support on the college campuses. Because McCarthy was a kind of cool customer, you know. He did not inspire great passion. And Bobby did. You know, you would see those rallies or driving through Watts in an open car. I mean, you think now the chances he took all the time, and the crowds just surging towards his car, and you know, it was magical.
Yeah, I think the night he died, or the day he died, his hand was so raw from shaking people's hands that he barely could lift it. He almost had to go to the hospital just to have his hand treated. John, you were a college. I mean, again, this comes back to why things seem so different in many ways from today. You were a college student. You'd already become the manager for Dylan's tour, and yet you were involved in politics. Kennedy was loved by young people. I think if there's it wasn't so much ideology that drove him, it was a generational quality. Somehow he captured the spirit of youth. Unlike any politician, I think on the left or the right since. Going back to 68 and that year, obviously, of tragedy, but also of youth, what does that tell us? What kind of hope or warning might it give us about the power of youth, of its vitality to change America?
Well, I mean, the obvious problem is that the Democratic Party today is a gerontocracy. I mean, that Biden actually felt he could stay in and should be the candidate is sad. And that until Nancy Pelosi stepped away, you know, the party was ruled by people in their late 80s. And, you know, I don't know a single corporation that would allow a CEO to be there in their late 80s. You know, they just know, you know, there's a reason there's a 65-year-old retirement age. And, you know, whether it's the Supreme Court or it's the Congress or whatever, you know, and look, our president is going to be, what, 82 when he retires? 83?
Maybe your president, John. He's not mine.
Well,
I'm teasing you.
You know, so, I mean, I think that, you know, John Kennedy was, aside from Theodore Roosevelt, who came in because he was vice president of a man that got assassinated, but John Kennedy was the youngest president of the time. And that sense of a youthful generation was so invigorating. And of course, it was so much of the time. I mean, the sense that innovation and energy and all of that, and it's all, of course, tied up with the culture, because culture is built by young people. It's not built by old people. And so that's really, for me, the big change that I see. I mean, we've somehow got to reinvigorate the Democratic Party if we're going to have something that looks like what was happening in early 1968.
And the relationship, John, between culture and politics is complicated, but youth in culture is reflected in politics and vice versa. I mean, 1968 was the time Bobby Kennedy, when he was killed. I'm not sure exactly how old he was, but he remained a young man. He was the younger brother of JFK. And as you've noted, all the culture of the time was being driven by youth. So it was no coincidence that politics and culture were defining and redefining America and enabling the world to fall in love with America. America was the hope of everyone, not just Americans.
Totally. Let me tell you just a little story. I was in 1989, I was making a movie in Berlin with a German director named Wim Wenders. And we needed a very large soundstage.
What was the movie?
It was called Until the End of the World. And we needed a very large soundstage to do some special effects shots. And the only one in Berlin, and this is before the wall came down, right, was on the east side, in East Berlin. It was called Babelsberg Studio. And so, because Wim was very highly respected director in Germany, had made Wings of Desire in Paris, Texas, and a lot of movies that won the Grand Prize in Cannes.
American Friend, of course.
He was able to arrange for us to shoot at Babelsberg. So every day we would go over through Checkpoint Charlie with 3 cars and go in and film at Babelsberg. And when we'd finish, we'd come out into there was a cafeteria in the studio that had a bar. And all the local East German film workers were there at the bar, drinking. And what was on the wall was 3 very large TV sets, especially for East Berlin, showing MTV Europe, because they had a satellite dish on the roof of Babelsberg Studio. It was allowed. And what I realized is these kids had already gone over the wall. Emotionally, they were completely connected to American culture and American music. And they all were wearing Levi's and U2 t-shirts, and they were there already. And so I said to Wim, I said, Christ, these kids are already on their side. They're free on the other side of the wall. And he nodded and he said, 2 years ago, David Bowie came to Berlin to give what was called the Concert for Berlin. And they set up the stage near the wall. And halfway through the set, there were 10,000 kids on the other side of the wall in East Berlin who could hear the music and who had gathered. And they flipped out, the guy in Dresden who was running KGB for that part of the area was Vladimir Putin. And within...
Who almost got lynched later that year in 1989.
Yeah, and so essentially, when Genesis came on after Bowie, it got so crazy that they came in with truncheons and everything and drove all the kids away from the wall. So we're here again. There's this sense that the culture was what brought down the wall. There was not a gun fired.
Do we need then, John, a generational revolt? I think it was the book before last, it was an autobiography, you focused on your complicated, to put it politely, relationship with your father, who was a classic post-war executive. You rebelled against him. If youth is to come back to power, if we're going to somehow recapture the spirit of 1968, don't we need another kind of rebellion?
We do, but here's the thing that scares me. Elon Musk was able to attract a huge number of young men to vote for Donald Trump. Now, Musk has 200 million followers on X. Now, how many of those are bots? We don't know, because we know that Musk used bots to grow his following a lot when he was in the business of hyping Tesla stock. And he was able to move Tesla stock from $70 a share to $1,100 a share just by hyping it on X, which was the reason he ended up buying X, because he saw it could really be used to drive attention. So, you know, when I wrote my friend Greil Marcus, who's a great American critic, I said, where is the counterculture of today? And he said, well, Tap, you might not want to think that it's a counterculture looks anything like the counterculture of the 60s. It might be that the counterculture of today is white nationalism. And what he meant by that was that the mainstream culture had become what we thought was counterculture. And that to rebel against that was the project of Musk and Tucker Carlson. And so now I ended up disagreeing with him, because I said counterculture requires some kind of culture, right? I mean, Bob Dylan knew how to write a song. Kid Rock is never going to be remembered 10 years from now. He will fall down the memory hole. So the idea that the right has any kind of culture is...
But isn't this the old cultural argument, John? You and I have talked about this before. I remember my father saying to me that Bob Dylan couldn't sing, and I'm sure you heard it from your father and his generation. Every generation rejects the cultural value and pretense of young people.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not being critical of hip-hop or whatever you happen to like right now. I am critical of the sense that everybody has sold out. I can't turn on my TV without having Snoop Dogg shilling some product. I mean, he seems to be advertising everything. So it's obvious to me that Snoop Dogg will come up and sell your product as long as the check clears. And to be honest, in my day, if you were a serious rock musician or a serious actor, you wouldn't be caught dead in an advertisement. That would be the end of your career. And so somehow advertising has taken over everything. And the most clear example of it is the fact that Google and Meta are two of the largest corporations in the world. All they are is a vehicle for advertising, and, you know, in a strange sense, they were when the world began to stall, they were the answer. You know, whether it was the stall of the fall of 2008 and the Great Recession, or the stall of the pandemic, the notion that you could send someone a message to their phone as they were walking along the street and know that they were 2 blocks from the Nike store and you could send them a Nike ad is astonishing.
I take your point. You and I have talked about this before. We've both written books about it. But coming back to the responsibility, does the 60s and 70s generation have some responsibility? Bruce Springsteen showed up for Kamala Harris, didn't seem to make much impact. I think now he's a billionaire. He's still touring at the age of 75. The Rolling Stones are still touring, making huge amounts of money. There's a new Dylan biopic. I mean, we can't blame Dylan for that, coming out later this year, which I'm looking forward to seeing. is one of the problems, just as Joe Biden didn't leave the stage early enough, the Stones and Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, they didn't leave the stage either. Don't they have maybe not our generation, your generation, because you were involved with these people, you still know them. I mean, what would Marcus say, Grail Marcus?
Totally held on to power too long. The boomers held on to power too long. That's the God's truth. And the problem is that the boomers have all the money, and what do they want to see when they go out to a concert night? They want to see the people that can somehow connect them back to a point. You know, I was in a big arena in Tulsa, Oklahoma last year. Bruce was playing, and there were like 15,000 boomers. It was 11 o'clock at night. They were up long past their bedtime, and they're all with their fists raised because the night belongs to lovers, you know? And I was thinking, oh, these people are engaged in a deep kind of nostalgia about a moment that they can remember in the 70s when they were in sweaty sheets with some girlfriend and Bruce was on the radio, you know?
Yeah, and I had exactly the same experience in San Francisco. I paid for the ticket, so I'm part of the problem myself. But there is something pathetic about it. I mean, even Bruce trying to walk on the crowd at 70 years old and having a group of helpers making sure that he didn't fall over. There's something absurd about the whole... It's a culturally absurd moment.
Yeah, but they're just going where the money is, right? The boomers are not interested in seeing, you know, Charlie XXX. I'm sorry.
So let's talk then about this new generation. You've got kids, grandkids, I've got kids. Is there an odd kind of generational war going on now? People say that the young people shouldn't be allowed to watch, to access social media. There's a lot of criticism of the culture of anxiety, a woke culture, a campus culture, a lot of controversy about young people's support for Gaza. Is this something in an odd way similar to what happened in the 60s, even if guys like you are on the other side of the barricades?
I think what has happened is that the notion of counterculture has been replaced by the notion of a subculture. And I don't mean one, I mean hundreds of them. So what has happened is that in '68, there was a very centralized media system in the sense that there were 3 television channels and there was you know, a few newspapers and one big radio station in every town and everything like that, and there was a top 40 and there was, you know, whatever was going on, everybody was sharing it. A Beatles record would come out and everyone would buy it, and it would go to the #1 spot immediately, right? So what is happening right now is that when I ask my grandchildren what they're listening to, they all have like 20 different people that are so diverse, and they all have relatively small audiences. Taylor Swift and Beyonce have huge audiences, but a lot of the music is shared by a niche, a subculture. And it may be a transsexual pushing subculture of, you know, Chapel Rowan. It may be, you know, some kind of obscure brand of Atlanta hip hop. You know, and so there's nothing that people are sharing. Little niches are sharing it, but there's nothing, you know, kind of universal where everybody, I mean, you know, we talked about JFK. So what happened 2 months after JFK was assassinated. The Beatles come on Ed Sullivan, and 72 million people watched on one night that performance. 72 million people on one TV program. That was a shared experience of joy. And I would argue that that was the beginning of the real 60s. That was the beginning of the rock and roll cultural 60s. I want to hold your hand. The sense of joy, the sense of everything that kind of took off from there. You know, out of tragedy came something kind of wonderful. So, but we don't have those kind of shared experiences today. It's impossible because the internet balkanized everything. And everybody's in their own little niche and they don't have to, I mean, look, the truth is, if somebody can get something like the Haitians ate your cats and your dogs and get 60 million people to believe it, you have to just think, what the hell is going on?
Can we compare and contrast then Bobby Kennedy with his son, RFK Jr., who of course is Trump's new, at least candidate for health secretary? Do they somehow capture the shift in American politics, father and son, and yet so profoundly different?
RFK Jr.
He doesn't live far from here, does he? I mean, he's in LA too.
He's a grifter. He's a grifter and an addict. And like a lot of addicts, you know, truth has nothing to do with anything he says, and he's not interested in the truth. He's interested in maybe selling books or selling a non-profit, quote-unquote, organization that you give money to that will pay his bills. I think his father would be embarrassed by him, quite honestly.
But his father was vital. He had agency.
I don't think RFK Jr. has agency.
Yeah, and it comes back to,
vitality.
I mean, maybe it's a form, you know, this whole question of addiction is so central in our dilemma at the moment. I think Kennedy's father offered all his kids $1,000, which was a lot back then, even for wealthy families like the Kennedys, if they didn't drink or smoke. I mean, obviously taking drugs by the time they were 21.
Right.
The only kid who came through on that was Bobby Kennedy. His vitality was rooted in an ability to master himself, and of course his son is the reverse of that. As you say, he's an addict, and his addictions control him rather than the reverse.
Well, look, let's be honest. Bobby Kennedy, the elder, was a person who was willing to work within the establishment. I mean, I believe that he didn't believe that Oswald killed his brother for a second, but he saw no purpose in saying that publicly. He didn't see a way out for himself or anybody else. And of course, he had his own worries, which would be that if the more people probed the anti-Castro movement, the more they would realize that he was paying mafia guys to try and kill Castro, and that was not something he was really interested in having come out. And he also was probably not interested in hurting his sister-in-law in terms of all the other revelations about Jack's womanizing and stuff like that. So, I mean, so he played by the rules. Obviously, our president, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., doesn't give a damn about that. I mean, he's just trying to stir things up, and that's partially a factor of internet culture.
You brought up the internet a few times. You and I have written lots of books about the internet, both critically. Let's try and end positively. If we're going to get some cultural vitality back, if America is to reclaim its mantle as the beacon, going back to that East Berlin where everyone admired American culture, American politics, American democracy, are you suggesting we need to get beyond the internet, or can it be done within the context of the digital revolution and digital technology?
I actually think that the internet protocols themselves, the stuff that Vint Cerf and all these guys designed, is very useful. I think the problem is the advertising business. And if there was a public internet that didn't require advertising, just like the BBC is in the UK, then I think that could be a hope for us to try and think differently about how we use it to communicate. Because from my point of view, the decentralized nature of communication that was the dream of Stuart Brand and Vint Cerf and people like that initiated that, and I know you talked to John Markoff about this, those things would be wonderful if it could happen. And of course, what happened was, it's not decentralized at all. It's owned by Google and Meta, and maybe a little bit by X. And that was not the idea that the guys that dreamed it up, Doug Engelbart and all those people, that wasn't their idea at all.
So where's the hope then? It's not realistic that the BBC or NPR or public radio is going to take over the internet, because it's just not going to happen.
No, why not? Well, if we taxed advertising, so we spend about $290 billion a year on advertising. If you had a 2% tax on advertising, you would raise enough money to have as big a budget as the BBC has, and it broadcasts in 40 countries. And you would basically have a public media system. It would have an internet streaming component, it would have a television component, and have a radio component. But it would be not controlled by the advertising business. And that's what makes everything so screwed up.
And if that was to happen, let's close our eyes and imagine and hope for the best. Why would that result in a cultural reinvention, regeneration?
Because at some basic point, people would be making decisions as to what they were going to finance for production based on what was good, not what was getting the most clicks.
Isn't that how the publishing business runs? Or even...
Kind of.
Or Hollywood?
No, Hollywood doesn't run that way anymore. It used to. But the book business still kind of runs that way.
So, but you are, John, I know you're in the process of writing a hopeful book about the future of America. Yeah. You are hopeful.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's going to be a cultural revolution. I think there's going to be a renaissance in America. And usually it happens when there's a slightly repressive political regime. It certainly happened. You think of what was going on in the early 1950s. While Joe McCarthy was out accusing everybody of being a commie, Miles Davis and Charlie Parker were making the most amazing music ever. The Weavers and Pete Seeger were running around and reinventing folk music, and Sam Fuller was making extraordinary movies, and this all in the face of the most repressive fear-laden regime ever.
As it happens, of course, RFK started his career working for McCarthy. It didn't last very long, but he remained a friend of the senator for much of his life. And then politics, John, how will this get manifested? Where are we going to find another RFK?
That's the hard part, I must say. As I said to you before, I think Chris Murphy is a brilliant politician, which if he would step up, could show people the way, but we'll see.
Murphy being from Connecticut, the senator.
Senator for Connecticut, who, to my mind, has a better sense of what's going on politically in America than anybody I know.
And finally, to come back to your friend Graham Marcus's observation, is it conceivable that the counterculture he talks about, the young men who follow Musk and Trump, that they could generate interesting ideas, interesting movies and songs and books, and they were the ones, whether they're male or female, could drive this renaissance you're looking for?
No. I mean, I once was invited to a dinner with Andrew Breitbart, and he said, we need to start our own Hollywood. We need to have our own movie studio. We need to do all this. We need to make culture because culture is upstream from politics. He was right about that, but I said to him, well, that's a stupid idea because you're not going to get anybody like talented like Steven Spielberg going to want to make right-wing propaganda. I'm sorry. All you're going to get is a bunch of first-person shooter games. You can finance that. Call of Duty, all that right-wing crap that's in the video game business, but you're not going to get any serious movies because all the movie directors I know are empathetic people.
Well, John Taplin, you produced Mean Streets, one of the great movies in my view, not just of, when was it, late 60s or 70s? You made, when did you produce Mean Streets?
73.
Well, one of the great movies, not just of the early 70s, but of all time. You know your movies. It's always a pleasure, John, to have you on the show. I know you're in the process of writing a book about all this stuff, and we will get you back on the show in the not too distant future. Great. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. It's always fun.
He's an expert.